added to the new LCIPP web portal that's being launched soon. So they'll serve as a very valuable resource now and into the future. We'd like to ask all the speakers to please keep your videos on throughout the event. And finally, because of new security features for this webinar, if any participant would like to make a comment or ask a question of the speakers, please use the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen, and our co-facilitators will monitor the questions and relay them to the speakers at the appropriate time. So with that, I'll hand it over to Daly, our facilitator, one of our co-facilitators, to get the webinar started.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and a special thanks to all of the presenters that have joined us for the fourth and final training webinar of Activity 4 of the Facilitative Working Group. My name is Daly Sambo-Duro. I'm an Inuk from Alaska and presently the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. I am fortunate to have been named the Arctic representative for the Facilitative Working Group. As many may know, the Arctic region is comprised of Inuit and Sami. And I actually look forward to handing off the position to a Sami colleague, and we're fortunate in the Arctic region to have this good and close collaboration. Myself am a co-lead, as Joanna has indicated, of this particular activity. And I just want to emphasize that the activity is primarily targeted at state party members to the UNFCCC, and our objective being to raise their awareness about the substance of Indigenous knowledge. So I think it's an important and unique element of the Facilitative Working Group work plan. I'll hand it off to Tom for an introduction.
Thanks very much, Daly, and hello to all the participants and to our speakers. Thank you very much to you all for joining us. As Daly said, my name is Thomas Cameron. I'm a senior advisor within Canada's Ministry for the Environment, called Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm also the party representative on the Facilitative Working Group for the Western Europe and Others group. So I'm very pleased to be here with all of you today, and very much looking forward to hearing from our exceptional speakers. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Daly, to give us a summary of the last 3 webinars.
Thank you, Tom. As I stated, this is the 4th and final webinar of Activity 4. And for those that didn't have an opportunity to tune in to the first 3 webinars, I will simply indicate that the initial one was in order to illustrate the need for understanding, recognizing, respecting, and increasing the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate change. We were fortunate to have Naomi Kapuri from a Maasai from Kenya, Atencio Lopez from Latin America or Central America. Many may know of him and his early work concerning the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We're also fortunate to have Victoria Bushman, an Inuk from Alaska, but now presently living in Greenland. In addition, we had in the second webinar on the question of what does ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate change look like, we were able to hear a presentation from E.E. Min, who emphasized some very unique elements of Indigenous knowledge within her region, especially related to weather and forecasting of weather. We had also in the second webinar, Dwayne Chiliyazi, a Dine from Navajo Nation, who spoke about the importance of safeguarding Mother Earth. In the third webinar, which looked at the utilization of Indigenous knowledge and its synthesis and co-production of Indigenous knowledge, we were fortunate to hear from Alicia Mousseau, and she is the Vice President of the Oglala Sioux Nation. Also, we heard previously from Slava Shadrin. We were fortunate to hear about Indigenous knowledge and its development in the context of the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction dialogue taking place both informally and formally from our mutual colleague Clement Yo Mulalip. In addition, we've heard from Jessica Wagner, an Aboriginal woman from Australia, talking about the traditional use of fire and land management in that particular context. We're also fortunate to hear from Ana Curtula de Cheve, a woman who headed up the social sciences program at the National Science Foundation, give her perspective as a former federal government employee that has been advocating for Indigenous knowledge being included in the context of substantial federal funding from the National Science Foundation. So we've had a really diverse mix of views and contributions from Indigenous peoples from each of the sociocultural regions of the world, as well as some party members and also former state party members as well. And we look forward to your contributions in the context of today's program. Tom?
Great, thank you for that summary, Daly. So today our objective is to take that understanding that we built at the previous webinars and drill down on some ways for parties to move forward in true partnership with Indigenous peoples and ethically engage Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate action. So our speakers today will aim to provide you with some examples of what substantive and procedural measures need to be taken to ensure ethical engagement with Indigenous knowledge. Our hope is that their examples will help guide parties by providing an initial starting point from which they can integrate contextually appropriate safeguards into their ethical engagement with Indigenous knowledge. To achieve this, our webinar will be broken into two parts. The first part will be training by our experts. We are pleased to be joined by 5 diverse experts from Bolivia, Indonesia, Kenya, Finland, and France, each of whom I will introduce shortly. Each speaker will then have 10 minutes to present. The second part of will be a 45-minute question and answer period. We encourage you to take advantage of all the experts we have with us today and ask them your questions. If you do have any questions, I'd ask that you please submit them in the Zoom using the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that Q&A function and we'll draw questions from there. Before we get started, I'd also like to just remind everyone that we do have interpretation available in English, Spanish, Russian, and French, which you can access by clicking the interpretation button below. With that, I'll introduce our first speaker and begin the first part of the webinar. So our first speaker is Maria Eugenia Choc Gespe, an Aymara from Bolivia. She has a degree in social work, a master's degree in Andean history, and she is currently doing her PhD in development sciences. Since 1990, she has dedicated her work to strengthening Indigenous organizations, focusing on the strengthening and recovery of Indigenous knowledge and the participation of Indigenous women in Andean communities of Bolivia. From 2014 to 2016, she was a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues and authored a study on the treatment of Indigenous knowledge in the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. From 2015 to 2019, she was an electoral authority in the Supreme Electoral Tribunal of Bolivia, and during her term, she focused on Indigenous autonomy processes. She is also part of the Network of Indigenous Women on Biodiversity. Maria, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a iniciar esta presentación. Saludar a todos ustedes y agradecer por la invitación para participar en este evento. El tema que puse en mi presentación titula La Madre Naturaleza. La Madre Tierra está enojada. En Aymara es Pachamama Tipusitawa. Esto por la crisis que enfrenta por la crisis climática que enfrenta el mundo. También quiero mencionar que la humanidad depende de la biodiversidad, la cual es vital en las economías globales, locales. El mundo depende de la biodiversidad por la producción de alimentos, del agua. En sí, dependemos de la vida, de la biodiversidad. El conocimiento tradicional está ligado a la biodiversidad. Para los pueblos indígenas, los conocimientos tradicionales tienen un carácter holístico, integral. En el pueblo aymara se dice que los conocimientos tradicionales recorren un camino, y este camino en aymara es el saharaui. Los seres humanos transitamos por el camino, por el saharaui, sobre la base de nuestros conocimientos tradicionales. Por eso que el conocimiento integral, el conocimiento tradicional es integral, porque está estrechamente ligado con el idioma, la memoria, la historia corta, la historia larga, la memoria corta, la memoria larga. Las prácticas tradicionales, los mitos, los cuentos, las leyendas, los cantos son parte de todo lo que es el conocimiento tradicional. Los conocimientos tradicionales tienen un valor potencial, por ejemplo, en la producción de alimentos. No es únicamente una práctica técnica, no es la mera técnica, sino está ligado al territorio, a la identidad, a la salud, porque es parte integral. Cuando se siembra, por ejemplo, es determinada canción, determinado instrumento, y son las mujeres las que cantan a la madre tierra, a la Pachamama. Es también cierto que por el carácter colonial de nuestros países, los conocimientos tradicionales no son considerados en su real dimensión. Son vistos como ahistóricos, retrógradas. En aymara se dice chulpapacha, el tiempo antiguo, pero el conocimiento es innovador y se va reproduciendo en la vida. Entonces, no se reconoce la titularidad de estos conocimientos tradicionales en los pueblos indígenas. Un tema también que quiero tocar es que toda esta pérdida de la biodiversidad está también ligado a lo que son las prácticas, las normas, leyes nacionales, internacionales, coloniales. La ley agraria ha separado entre lo que es tierra, territorio, espiritualidad. Entonces, los pueblos indígenas sufrimos de que no son considerados en su real dimensión la titularidad de los conocimientos. Quiero entrar a esta página que dice integralidad del sistema de Naciones Unidas. Los sistemas de Naciones Unidas como el CBD, como la OMPI, como la UNESCO, si bien hablan de los conocimientos tradicionales, lo ven de una forma parcializada. No están viendo que el conocimiento tradicional, los conocimientos tienen un carácter holístico, no están separados, son integrales. Decía, por ejemplo, la práctica del sembradío de la papa está ligado con la espiritualidad, con la gestión de gobierno, que son las autoridades en los territorios indígenas. Voy a pasar a lo que también me han pedido, la consideración de cuáles serían las medidas sustantivas que los representantes de los estados tienen que considerar para el compromiso ético de los poseedores de los conocimientos y el uso de los conocimientos tradicionales. Quiero entrar primero tomando en cuenta que se debe tomar en cuenta la titularidad de los conocimientos tradicionales. Los pueblos son los titulares de los conocimientos tradicionales, porque son los herederos de una milenaria trayectoria histórica antiquísima y que son transmitidos de generación en generación. Estas vienen de una memoria colectiva, de una memoria también corta. Asimismo, también quiero decir que los conocimientos tradicionales se constituyen en la lucha y resistencia de los pueblos indígenas. Se constituyen en la demanda del derecho a la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas. Voy a pasar al tema de gobernabilidad. El conocimiento tradicional no está separado de los valores culturales y la identidad. Son prácticas que conllevan valores espirituales. Conlleva una forma de reproducción de estos conocimientos tradicionales. Estos conocimientos tradicionales son, vamos a decir, controlados, manejados, administrados por los gobiernos indígenas. El otro punto es la gestión territorial. Son las autoridades que tienen y cumplen esta gestión territorial bajo la mirada de las autoridades tradicionales. El otro punto es la institucionalidad indígena. Los pueblos indígenas tienen leyes, normas propias y su adopción depende de estas, vamos a decir, de estas acciones de adopción colectiva. Siempre las decisiones son colectivas. Voy a pasar a los compromisos éticos. Compromiso ético, el respeto que debe existir en la comunidad. En Aymara hay un refrán que dice, a la gente se debe ver con respeto porque es persona. La participación debe ser plena y activa. La participación, por ejemplo, en el sembradío tiene un carácter festivo. El trabajo es festivo. Está en todo lo que implica el trabajo, que implica fiesta y no sacrificio. Por el carácter colonial, el trabajo hoy se ha convertido en esclavitud y sacrificio. Asimismo, quiero decir también de que el tema, la transparencia, el valor ético, valor espiritual, la consulta, el consentimiento, el consenso, la paridad. El buen vivir es otra de las prácticas que tiene que ser considerado como el buen vivir, que es la búsqueda incesante del bienestar en los pueblos indígenas. Y en esto, el tema del rol de la mujer, la participación de la mujer, porque ella es la transmisora del conocimiento tradicional. A pesar de que en las mujeres vivimos pues la discriminación, el racismo, la pobreza, pero ellas son las transmisoras del conocimiento tradicional. También quiero decir que la transmisión de estos conocimientos es por el rol de las mujeres que tienen que transmitir en la forma así de una participación plena y efectiva de educación en los jóvenes indígenas. También este último punto que quiero pasar a lo que es cuáles serían los procedimientos. Procedimiento prácticamente que tiene que ver con aquello que son los protocolos comunitarios. Instrumentos, herramientas que nos permiten pues controlar las investigaciones en la biodiversidad. Y por otro lado, quiero también mencionar como un instrumento el protocolo de Nagoya, la implementación del protocolo de Nagoya. En su artículo 12, habla estrechamente de lo que son los protocolos comunitarios relacionados a conocimientos tradicionales. Por el tiempo, aquí voy a parar y muchas gracias por haberme escuchado.
Thank you very much, Maria, for that presentation. I really appreciated how much you were able to cover in that short time. And I think there were a lot of interesting points in terms of parties need to understand the holistic nature of Indigenous knowledge and not kind of take separate elements of it. And then I really do appreciate you outlining some of the substantive, ethical, and procedural measures that parties need to be aware of as they engage knowledge holders. So thank you very much. I really appreciated those comments. Moving to our next speaker, we have Monica Christiani Noon, and she is an Indigenous person from Rote, the east part of Indonesia. She completed her bachelor degree from law school in September 2013. She joined Alliance Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, which is an alliance of Indigenous communities across Indonesia, right after she graduated, and has been focused on Indigenous issues since then, particularly on Indigenous people's rights. In 2017, she joined the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Indigenous Fellowship in Geneva. In October 2020 to early 2021, she rejoined the fellowship as a senior Indigenous fellow and worked with the UN OHCHR regional office in Southeast Asia. Currently, she is the project manager and in charge of the international advocacy in AMAN. Monica, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I will share screen, my presentation. Can you hear my voice? Like, is it okay? Okay, because we're also experiencing internet problems every time. So it's one of the challenges in doing this online works. So thank you for the introduction, Thomas. As mentioned, I also an Indigenous person working with AMAN, I think the largest Indigenous organization in the world, because we have members. It covers more than 2,300 Indigenous members, Indigenous communities as our members. So that's why we're a very big organizations with also big responsibilities to assist Indigenous communities. It's good to learn and to hear from Maria, our Indigenous sister from a different country. It's good to learn their story, especially we're facing this crisis, which is this pandemic, and there are different situations that experienced by Indigenous peoples in each countries and in each of our communities. In the context of Indonesia, when you talk about traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, I want to give a picture of the current situation in Indonesia. When you talk about pandemic of this COVID-19, the crisis, in the context of Indigenous peoples, there are two situations, two specific situations that we can see for Indigenous communities. One is those Indigenous communities that have full rights and access to their territories. For those Indigenous communities, they don't have to be scared about being criminalized, about being, receiving threats of doing traditional activities in their territories. Because they have full access, they have full rights to their territories, and they can do, the farming, fishing, and other kind of traditional activities, doing because here in Indonesia, we also have our Indigenous schools in different Indigenous communities. So it's also a good step to, protecting the young generation of Indigenous peoples to keep the traditional knowledge. And so for those Indigenous communities, when the pandemic hits, they don't experience difficulties in doing their daily activities. They're in practicing their traditional knowledge. And the second situation is those Indigenous communities whose land are stolen. When their territories or their land are confiscated, they're forced to go out from their communities. They're forced to go out to find job in the city, or to find job in the companies that actually took their land, their territories, which is ironic, but that's the reality. And when the pandemic hits, they're being laid over and they're being jobless, and they don't have land anymore to meet their daily needs and to practice their traditional knowledge. So there are two different situations that experienced by indigenous communities in Indonesia. So we can see here, these are the pictures from indigenous communities who still doing their traditional activities. We encourage them to do more like farming in their territories, and these activities actually happened in the middle of pandemic, and it shows that these communities are being resilient in the middle of pandemic because they're practicing their traditional knowledge, and we can see in the context of Indonesia, the government is relying on the big investors, big companies, and when the pandemic hits, they cannot help the recovery of economic of Indonesia. But look at the indigenous peoples and local communities. They don't really affected by this pandemic when they have full access and rights to their territories. So these are the pictures. They're doing the rituals before doing the land clearing for farming. See, and then the women also play a very big role in protecting and practicing their traditional knowledge. As you can see in the picture, this is their harvest. It's also important to protect the traditional institution of indigenous peoples. In the context of Indonesia, the indigenous peoples as law subject are not recognized yet in the national law. As you can see here, I mentioned about the traditional knowledge, but also don't forget that if we talk about the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, it's also important to talk about indigenous peoples as law subject, because you can talk about the traditional knowledge and then forgetting the indigenous peoples itself. So when you recognize indigenous peoples, when the state, for example, recognize indigenous peoples in the regulations, in the law, it means they're also recognizing the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, because also mentioned by Maria, it's inseparable. The indigenous peoples, their traditional knowledge, their territories, it's inseparable. And it's also proved by the case that I mentioned, when they're being deprived, when their land is confiscated, it means they're also losing their traditional knowledge. They're losing their language. We have many examples of those kinds of indigenous communities where they don't anymore talk their traditional language because they're being washed away from their territories. And these are the regulations in Indonesia that we have now. So the traditional knowledge is mentioned in is reflected in the Indonesia Constitution, 1945. And there are some ratification of a convention that I mentioned here, but these regulations are not enough and not specifically protecting and regulating the traditional knowledge. And then in the document of NDC of Indonesia, it also mentioned that the government of Indonesia is they acknowledge that the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is part of to mitigate and tackle the effect of climate change. It's in the NDC. So while in the fact what in the national context, it's different from what is written in the NDC. So that's very important to see, to look at these documents and really implement at the national level. And there's a question on how to ensure within the UNFCCC process, how to ensure that Indigenous knowledge holders are ethically engaged. The first recommendation that came into my mind is that should provide policy to include Indigenous knowledge holders in the state official delegation to UNFCCC, because it's also important. It shows also a political commitment by the government when they do this. It's important to ensure this. The second one is state can organize Indigenous knowledge holders forum with other stakeholders to gather examples of success stories on Indigenous knowledge practices in response to climate change mitigation and adaptation. It's also this also important to be done at the national level by the government. And sorry. And then yeah, it should be done also at the national level by the state. Sorry, and then another question is how can constitute bodies within the UNFCCC ethically engage with and promote the use of Indigenous knowledge. First is to establish specific inter-constitute bodies guidelines on the engagement with Indigenous knowledge. As we know that the UN development groups has guidelines on Indigenous people's issues, and it's also good for the constitute bodies within the UNFCCC to also develop this kind of guidelines. And for SBSTA to continue their effort on compiling examples of good practices, tools, methods, and data collection initiatives on the use of local, Indigenous, and traditional knowledge and practices for adaptation. So I think that's all. I will end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I really appreciated those remarks and kind of the linkages that were between your remarks and Maria's. I really do appreciate the kind of concrete recommendations that you brought forward in terms of inclusion of Indigenous peoples on national delegations, engagement, meaningful engagement in national climate and adaptation policies. I think, what really came through in your presentation is that for that engagement to be meaningful, there has to be a recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and communities. So I thank you for that and for those recommendations. I think there's a lot of linkages with a number of other activities that are taking place under the platform that will provide good food for thought. So with that, I turn to our third speaker. I think that unfortunately he is having some connection issues and hasn't been able to join us. So we'll leave a placeholder for him to join later if he's able to, but we'll go to our fourth speaker, Zakhonberry, who is a Sami from the Detnu River Valley in Finland. He is a salmon fisher, a teacher, and a member of the Sami Parliament from Northern Sapmi. He is involved in Sami and Indigenous issues at the national level and internationally with the United Nations. He has taught North Sami language in the Sami University of Applied Sciences and is a recent graduate of the University of Tromsø Sapmi in Norway, where he did a master's degree in Indigenous studies. His work on Indigenous knowledge has focused upon salmon fishing, an important activity in his community, which transcends the border between Finland and Norway. Alsak, you have the floor.
Thank you. Kiitos ja puerre baby puhkaide ja kiitos poutahusas servahteike. So, hello everyone, and thank you for the invitation daily to join this event. I noticed that I did not send my updated bio to you. That's maybe 2 years old. So I am not anymore in the Sami Parliament, but I'm currently a vice president of the Sami Council. I have not been much involved in the climate change convention, more on the CBD, the biodiversity convention. So my reflections will be more of a general nature and not so specifically on the process. So I want to start first by talking in generally about the Sami indigenous knowledge. Then I will look into some challenges that there are for including indigenous knowledge into research. Then I will go into a few good practices regarding co-production of knowledge, and then look into some needs for improvement. Arbetehtu is the North Sami word for indigenous knowledge. And I want to start my description of Arbetehtu with a quote from a local fisherman. He said, I believe this was already in the 70s, he said that those who have learned from books have studied issues in school for a short time. Their knowledge is incomplete. Us, people of the river, have at least 1,000 years of experience. We know the river and the ways of the salmon. And these were the words of Erke Ante or Antti Kateketa. So Arbetehtu, I will be using that Sami word, that is the Sami indigenous knowledge. So Arbetehtu is a holistic knowledge system, which is often based on long-term observations as well as trial and error. Arbemahtu is another Sami concept which can be translated into traditional skills. And these are the skills of utilizing Arbetehtu, traditional or indigenous knowledge. And these traditional skills are only maintained in practice. And so is a large part of Arbetehtu also maintained mainly in practice. Arbetehtu is transferred within its own social context and while practicing the traditional livelihoods and practices. So Arbetehtu can be of general nature. For example, what kinds of principles one must follow, such as recognition that resources are limited and one must not take more than is not take more than what is needed. So that is a key principle in the Sami indigenous knowledge. Another example is that when you're taking something, then you have to give something back. So this kind of reciprocal understanding of our role in the ecosystem, and this knowledge is transferred in stories and cultural expressions and so on. Of course, there is more specific kind of Arbetehtu, such as that relating to hunting grounds, grazing lands, fishing spots, berry picking sites, sacred sites. It can also relate to behavior of animals or properties of plants. And of course, some of indigenous knowledge can be shared, while other parts should not be public. And some of Sami indigenous knowledge has also monetary value, while as other is important in other ways. So a few thoughts on what kind of challenges, based on my experience, there are for including Sami indigenous knowledge into research. My focus is on the Finnish side of the Sami territories. So the main concern is the lack of bodies to deal with indigenous knowledge. So this kind of detailed Arbetehtu, it belongs to communities or even families. And there are no community level bodies who have capacity or mandate to deal or work with Arbetehtu. For example, the municipalities, which are a part of the Finnish governance structure, then they don't have any any capacity or knowledge on working with indigenous knowledge. So the Sami parliament on the Finnish side, they get a lot of requests for joining research projects or even requests if the parliament could grant research permissions. But neither the Sami parliament has a structure for doing this. So this kind of lack of organized way of including indigenous knowledge into research, then it often brings pressure to individuals as well as communities and institutions whose main task is not to work with this, but because there is nobody else to take this, then it falls onto them. So some considerations that in my view need to be made when doing research on Arpetehtu are, first, what kind of knowledge should be shared and what should not be shared, and who has the mandate to represent communities as rights holders of their knowledge, and then what is the right way of presenting Arpetehtu in an ethical and correct way in research. So my experience is that there is difficulties when, for example, biologists are working together with indigenous knowledge holders. My experience is that the root of this problem is that neither of them are familiar with the other's way of knowing or the other's knowledge system. So to generalize, if biologists work together with ecological indigenous knowledge, then they are not educated in Arpetehtu through the practice of the traditional skills nor otherwise. So they are not familiar with its ways of knowing or how knowledge is verified, for example, or created. And this then causes that Arpetehtu as a knowledge system is outweighed by the ways of knowing and verifying knowledge that they are familiar with, which is science. So this then again, looking from the perspective of the indigenous knowledge holders, they grow wary of the overlooking of their knowledge. So for example, from my local context in the Dietno River Valley, Sami knowledge holders have been raising some concerns regarding the salmon stocks for decades now. And the biologists often just say that based on our knowledge, these are not relevant factors, so they basically are overlooked. So this causes distrust from the Sami knowledge holders towards the biologists. So to summarize that part, I would say that the requirement for good cooperation is mutual respect, and that the individuals that are involved must be respectful towards the other knowledge system that they might not be so familiar with. And indigenous knowledge should be seen as valuable scientific knowledge. I see I'm running out of time, so I guess then I'll just jump into my conclusions. So when cooperating with indigenous knowledge holders, then it's important to allow enough time for internal processes, to look into who would be the right people to join, and also to allow establishing good working relationship, and because there is a need for some kind of capacity building also for the indigenous knowledge holders to understand the more scientific ways of knowing and communicating, but also for the researchers to be more familiar with transdisciplinary sciences as well as decolonizing research. So as I mentioned, then this lack of a systematic capacity to work with indigenous knowledge, it's a major issue that we run into often in our work, and there is need for this on local level, but also on a national or a more centralized way. And also people who hold indigenous knowledge, they hold it because they practice traditional livelihoods and practices. And often they're very busy doing this, and they can get overwhelmed by requests to join studies and give statements on impacts on their livelihoods of, let's say, legislation or development projects. So that is a clear need to build capacity on dealing with the indigenous knowledge, so that there would be a way of coordinating the work on Sami indigenous knowledge, and to assist the rights holders and the knowledge holders to get their knowledge as efficiently to be part of various kinds of studies. So I think I have to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aslak. I really appreciate your remarks, including kind of giving us a sense of the regional context of indigenous knowledge in your community, and then kind of outlining some of the key considerations around needing an infrastructure, the demands that are placed on the community for requests for engagement with indigenous knowledge, and then just the need for there to be respect and equal, a sense of different ways of knowing having equal value, or in some cases, I'm sure indigenous knowledge has more value than the scientific method. So needing to build that capacity and understanding among parties, I think, are some key points, and I really appreciate your remarks, so thank you. Moving to our next speaker, we're going with, will be Valerie Masson del Malt. She's a French climate scientist and research director at the French Alternative Energies and Atomic Energy Commission, where she works in the Climate and Environment Sciences Laboratory. Valerie uses data from past climates to test models of climate change and has contributed to several IPCC reports. She is presently co-chair of Working Group 1 of the IPCC, which assesses the physical science of climate change. She has stated the understanding of how the climate changes and the understanding of the role of humankind in this change, these two realizations are shaking up our relation to the environment. We are no longer in a state of uncertainty, staring at the sky, trying to figure out what might be coming down on us. We are not passive victims of natural disasters. We are actors and agents. And with that, Valerie, I'll give you the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for your invitation. And in this brief presentation, I would like to reflect on recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And as you know, the mandate of our report is to provide an objective, rigorous, and transparent assessment of the state of knowledge related to climate change, related risks, and response options based on scientific, technical, and socioeconomic publications. And we have to bring together multiple lines of evidence. I hope my presentation will show that indigenous knowledge is increasingly taken into account in the assessment, but with different ways. I will focus on the recent 3 special reports. First, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that was released in 2018. This report shows that populations at disproportionately higher risk of adverse consequences with a global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius include some indigenous peoples, especially those who depend on agricultural or coastal livelihoods, or in regions at disproportionately higher risk, such as Arctic ecosystems, dryland regions, small island developing states, and least developed countries. The report also shows that a wide range of adaptation options are available to reduce the risks to natural and managed ecosystems, and that this can build on local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and community-based adaptation, especially in rural landscapes. The report highlights the importance of education, information, community approaches, including those that are informed by indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, to accelerate the wide-scale behavior changes consistent with adapting to and limiting global warming to low levels such as 1.5 degrees Celsius. And finally, it highlights the importance of strengthening the capacities for climate action, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities, and the importance of international cooperation as a critical enabler, including for vulnerable regions. But as you can see, there was no direct engagement with holders of indigenous knowledge in that report. The second report that was released in 2019 was on climate change and land. And it is the first report that is addressing multiple challenges related to climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, desertification. And it also has a holistic food system approach, which is a novel way of looking at responses to multiple challenges, trade-offs, and co-benefits. And basically, I think it adds as a new dimension to the climate response options, the aspect of pressure on land. So this report covers, in a specific part of the assessment, literature whose methodologies include interviews and surveys with indigenous peoples and local communities. And based on indigenous and local knowledge, it highlights that climate change is already affecting food security in drylands, particularly in Africa, and high mountain regions of Asia and South America. So you can see that it is a different dimension compared to the previous one. Then it flags the importance of voluntary aspects, such as the use of scientific, local, and indigenous knowledge, as well as collective action, to achieve positive adaptation and mitigation outcomes, for instance, related to integrated landscape planning, or incentives regarding payment for ecosystem services or land use zoning. It highlights that policies that favor sustainable land management for climate change include empowering women and indigenous people and enhancing local and community collective action. It also shows the effectiveness of decision-making and governance to be enhanced by the involvement of local stakeholders, particularly those most vulnerable to climate change, including indigenous peoples and local communities, for the selection, the evaluation, the implementation and monitoring of policy instruments for land-based climate change adaptation and mitigation. And finally, it provides an emphasis that agricultural practices, including indigenous and local knowledge, can contribute to overcoming the combined challenges of climate change, food security, biodiversity conservation, and combating desertification and land degradation, and this with high confidence. So the message is important on coordinating action in partnership with indigenous peoples and local communities. I now move to the third special report that the IPCC has released in this cycle on the ocean and cryosphere. It is a report that looks at the cascading effects between human-induced climate changes in the physical world, effects on ecosystems, and effects on human societies. And authors of that report took a different approach to indigenous knowledge. They worked with what they call a champion with one foot in both worlds, the sphere of indigenous knowledge and the sphere of scientific knowledge, which was perceived to be key for establishing trust. And that champion worked with his indigenous network of young scholars to distill available published information, which is a key aspect of IPCC assessments. And the lesson learned is that it was highly appreciated by the indigenous peoples. And this could be something to build upon more in the future. I also flagged that the Inuit Circumpolar Council was invited to contribute on the use of indigenous knowledge, which can be sometimes challenging due to the nature of IPCC reports, where it is a consensus assessment building on multiple lines of evidence from the literature. So let me flag the few highlights regarding indigenous peoples and knowledge. Of course, changes in the cryosphere in the Arctic and high mountain areas have affected multiple aspects. We depend on food security, water resources, livelihoods, water quality, health, well-being, but also infrastructure, transportation, tourism, recreation, and cultures of societies, particularly for indigenous peoples. There's growing evidence that with high confidence, adaptation efforts in the Arctic have benefited from the inclusion of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and it's also the case in high mountains. It is noted that the impacts on ecosystem services have negative consequences, particularly for the health and well-being for indigenous peoples and local communities, for instance, those depending on fisheries. And future shifts in fish distribution, decrease in their abundance, and in fisheries catch potential due to climate change are projected to affect income, livelihoods, and food security of many marine resource-dependent communities around the world. The long-term loss and degradation of the marine ecosystems compromises aspects related to the ocean's role in cultural, recreational, and intrinsic values that are important for human identity and well-being. So these changes put key cultural dimensions of lives and livelihoods at risk, and they can include potentially rapid and irreversible loss of culture, local knowledge, and indigenous knowledge, also negative impacts on traditional diets and food security. Regarding the important issue of terrestrial and marine habitat restoration and tools for ecosystem management, the report concludes that such actions are most successful when they are community-supported, are science-based, whilst also using local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and the long-term support is crucial for their efficiency. Their efficiency can be limited to low levels of warming, though. And finally, the last points of the report flag the importance of regional policy frameworks and institutional arrangements that provide strong multi-scale linkages with local and indigenous communities. These are the arrangements that most benefit adaptation, and they can include coordination between national and transboundary regional policies, for instance, regarding water or fisheries. The last point is again related to investments in education and capacity building at various levels and scales, which facilitates social learning and long-term capability for responses to reduce risks and enhance resilience. And specific activities include using multiple knowledge systems and regional climate information into decision-making, which can be supported by the engagement of local communities, indigenous peoples, and relevant stakeholders. So the promotion of climate literacy and drawing on local, indigenous, and scientific knowledge systems is a key aspect to enable public awareness, understanding, and social learning about the local specific risks and the local context-specific response potential. Finally, a few thoughts. Broadening the participation in responding to climate change is important, and it's clear that context-specific solutions are most effective. One has to speak to the knowledge holders and also often compensate them for the time, as they are busy people, and that is a challenge for the integration of that knowledge. We don't have within IPCC specific tools for that. We need other networks to support that. We note that indigenous knowledge is contextual, and to add it with scientific knowledge, of course, people have to take time together to jointly understand how to make the best use of that. The most important point is to establish trust that is required for that and availability of time for that. To conclude, I'm now working on finalizing the main IPCC Working Group 1 report. It's on the physical science basis, and the intent is to release that report next July. There's strong emphasis, of course, on information regarding large-scale climate change, progress in understanding what shapes the behavior and response of the climate system, and climate information to inform decision-making at regional scales. We will release an interactive online atlas with that information, and we hope that this interactive atlas will be an opportunity for regional indigenous knowledge holders to build on this, to enrich that scientific information by their own knowledge and deep understanding of the needs in their communities, and so that new integrative knowledge and useful knowledge will be available for indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for providing that really comprehensive overview of some of the key findings of the IPCC report, and the kind of the fact that it's beyond a doubt the contributions that Indigenous peoples and local communities can make, as long as the key kind of elements for trust and respect are integrated. And I thank you for sharing some of the lessons learned from that. Unfortunately, we do not still seem to have our fifth speaker joining us, Kenyiki Masai from Kenya. So perhaps he'd be able to join for the Q&A, but otherwise I think we'll move to that section. So before I pass the floor back over to Daly, I would just like to note that I forgot to mention that the presentations that you saw today will be available online on the LCIPP page. So if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit that. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Daly to give her reflections as well as moderate the Q&A. And just a reminder that if you do have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A function in Zoom. Thank you. Daly.
Thank you very much, Tom, and a huge thank you to each of the presenters. I know that it took time in preparation and also time today, and I know that everyone is constantly busy, but your respective presentations have made huge contributions to this larger question of the co-production of knowledge. And in listening, I think there are a number of new elements that haven't been raised in the past webinar training sessions that we've already held. I think that Maria Eugenia, thank you for making the clear linkage to political institutions, that Indigenous knowledge is tied to everything and that it is interrelated, but more specifically your references to the political institutions and the collective ownership and the collective nature of Indigenous knowledge. But significantly, your presentation also helped to link this directly to Indigenous women and the role of Indigenous women in the context of Indigenous knowledge at the local level, at the regional level, and indeed your voice at the international level, as well as at the national level. Monica, thank you so much for revealing the fact that Indigenous peoples are a subject of law, and that it really has taken decades for this to develop at the international level. But as you've pointed out, there are areas around the globe that this element is missing, especially in terms of national law and policy and recognition of Indigenous peoples, as well as the diverse and comprehensive rights that have been affirmed in various different international instruments. I greatly appreciated your commentary about political commitment and the need for political commitment to develop laws and policy at the national or domestic level that are specifically related to Indigenous knowledge. Also, your suggestion of an Indigenous knowledge forum that would allow for greater understanding between Indigenous peoples as rights holders and also the state party actors at the national level, and indeed the potential for this kind of activity to take place at the international level. On that note, I want to indicate that there are plans to finalize this particular activity for purposes of the facilitative working group, but one of the elements of that is to host a roundtable of all of the presenters in order to ensure that our final report for the activity is accurate and reflective of the contributions that each of you have made as knowledge holders, but also to address any potential gaps that might emerge. But there'll be more information emerging as we move forward. Asla, thank you so much. I know that it took a bit of cajoling to get you to join the session, but I greatly appreciate the contributions that you've made, and significantly the linkage to skills, that not only knowledge, but skills, especially when Indigenous peoples are out there and on the land, on the ground, and engaged in their various and distinct ways of life, especially in relation to salmon fishing, but in a host of different ways. The context and being context specific, and your comments in relation to being context specific are really important, and it made me think of the fact that Indigenous knowledge doesn't only have a social, cultural, and traditional economic relevance, but as Maria Eugenia and Monica also indicated, this political dimension, or the substantive dimension of Indigenous knowledge. Thank you also for pointing out some of the challenges, as well as the considerations for again, the content of Indigenous knowledge in terms of the internal procedures and protocols of Indigenous peoples, identification of who Indigenous knowledge holders are, and the two different systems and approaches to knowledge. And finally, Valerie, thank you so much for taking time away from the plenary session that I know you're engaged in with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and illustrating the 3 different IPCC reports and how Indigenous knowledge has been revealed in these particular reports, but underscoring significantly that Indigenous knowledge is a key contribution in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and also some of the important streams in which Indigenous knowledge and science can be mutually reinforcing or complementary in terms of identification of ways forward to really take concrete action in regard to climate change. So I'm so appreciative for all of the contributions. Turning to the questions, we have had a number of different questions from the participants, but before we dive into some of those questions, I'd like to pose the general question to all of the presenters about some of your specific examples where genuine co-production of knowledge has emerged, and whether or not you can point to specific examples where mutual respect and trust has been developed and nurtured between Indigenous peoples and scientists. If there are any specific examples that really give us a good glimpse as to what is effective. anyone that would like to respond to that question? And if I can also ask for the presenters to turn on their videos so that we can, we as the facilitators can see, but also thank you so much. Yeah. Asa, did your body language looks like you want to offer. Oh, no. Okay, Maria Eugenia.
Sí, primero muchas gracias, hermana Dali, por los comentarios que nos hacen. Respecto a esta cuestión de un ejemplo que se lanza, el respeto mutuo, diremos, con lo que es una política nacional. Un ejemplo concreto para el caso de Bolivia por el tema de la pandemia es el uso de las plantas medicinales. El uso de las plantas medicinales prácticamente ha cubierto todo el territorio nacional porque, bueno, también la pandemia viene a ser como un efecto de la crisis climática. Y en esto se ha dado una apertura de ley nacional para que las plantas medicinales puedan ser expuestas en los mercados y también pueda ser accesible para todos, indígenas, no indígenas. Entonces, creo que tomado de la mano con la normativa nacional para este uso de las plantas medicinales para el tratamiento específico de la pandemia. Ya que estoy con la palabra, quiero aprovechar también en responder a las preguntas que me hicieron, como por ejemplo, cómo poner en valor y recuperar los conocimientos ancestrales, tradicionales, indígenas para la lucha contra el cambio, para combatir el cambio climático. Pienso que los conocimientos tradicionales ya están combatiendo al cambio climático. Tenemos estudios científicos que cada vez muestran que los territorios indígenas son ricos en biodiversidad. También de que la mitigación de los efectos del cambio climático en su respuesta, pues son los conocimientos tradicionales. Pero a pesar de esta evidencia, a pesar de que existen estudios científicos, los conocimientos aún no reciben el lugar que corresponde, el lugar de importancia que debe considerarse. Entonces, una posibilidad es que las instancias como las plataformas puedan incorporar en sus programas la incorporación de los conocimientos tradicionales dentro de una prioridad, así como el nombre, principal, ¿no? Para que realmente los pueblos, las mujeres indígenas puedan participar. Y con esto paso a la segunda pregunta, los derechos de la Pachamama, de la Madre Tierra y los saberes ancestrales. En Aymara hay un término y cuando se trabaja con la juventud es que se dice catocaña. Catocaña es en castellano recibir. Así se traduce. Pero en la reflexión del idioma mismo, catocaña es recibir con el corazón. La transmisión de los conocimientos tradicionales, la juventud la debe recibir con el corazón, con el aprendizaje. Entonces, es importante dentro de lo que es esto, vamos a decir, todo este trabajo, mirar el potencial de los conocimientos tradicionales. ¿Cómo? Trabajar en la tradición oral, en la memoria oral. Siempre la gente dice, es que antes se producía así, ahora se produce así. Antes vivíamos así, ahora se vive así. Ahí nos están diciendo cómo los conocimientos tradicionales son innovativos. Se conserva, se preserva y también son innovativos. Por ejemplo, en lo que implica la práctica del sembradío. En la práctica del sembradío es tan importante, o en la crianza de la llama, por ejemplo, en zonas pastoriles, donde no solamente es arrear la llama, sino implica cómo velar la reproducción de los animales. Y esto va acompañado de una espiritualidad. Quienes lo saben son los poseedores de estos conocimientos. Por ejemplo, de mitigar el cambio climático, alejar la lluvia, evitar el granizo, son las autoridades. Y aquí voy a un tema también que me gustaría de que podamos incorporar, que es el tema del gobierno local, las autonomías indígenas. Sistemas propios que las autoridades ayudan a proteger los derechos de la madre tierra. Sistemas propios que tienen que ver con todo lo que es los saberes locales, tiene que ver con aquello que es la recuperación de su autoridad tradicional. Entonces, ¿cómo este trabajo local de las autoridades del gobierno indígena, gobernabilidad indígena, chachahuarmi, la participación del gobierno local con paridad? Sabemos que las mujeres ocupamos el peor lugar, pues, ¿no? Por el tema colonial, pero en el tema de gobernanza, la mujer también es autoridad. Entonces, ¿cómo indagar de que el ejercicio de autoridad conlleve también prácticas de conocimiento tradicional en gobierno indígena, en economía, en política, en organización de la comunidad, del Ayllu, por ejemplo? Entonces, es importante de que el conocimiento tenga su real dimensión. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Thank you, Maria Eugenia. Gracias. Are there other panelists that would like to highlight examples where genuine co-production of knowledge has emerged? Monica, Valerie, Asla? Valerie.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to flag that in the IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere, there are a few examples that are developed. For instance, regarding locally managed marine areas in the Pacific, or the indigenous protected area in the North Baffin Bay, Polynesia, or systems for flood forecasting and disaster risk reduction in the Himalayas, or building on another type of knowledge, which is those of mountain guides, for instance, in the Alps. So these are a few examples that are developed in the report. And I have seen a question on the chat about the emphasis on adaptation rather than mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's because much of the indigenous and local knowledge has also been built from dealing with past natural climate variability over time. And so this is why there's a strong emphasis on the risk management, the adaptation side. And I think that there could be a potential now in engaging indigenous knowledge holders in the thinking of just transitions related to mitigation.
Great. Thank you. That is a common question, and certainly one that we have tackled with ourselves. I would like to invite Monica or Aslak if you have any commentary on genuine co-production of knowledge, any examples that you want to highlight? Aslak?
Yeah, thanks, Deli. Yeah, I can raise a few remarks on based on this very brief paper that is written by the Sami Council, as well as a few Arctic researchers on their personal experiences on co-creating research projects. So this is about a Horizon 2020 European funded application. It was not funded, but it's discussing the process and what made the process feel beneficial for them, even if it was not granted the funding. So a few things that I already mentioned in my presentation was the need to allow enough time. So what happened regarding this process was that the Sami Council were contacted 9 months before the first deadline of the application. So that allowed time for the council for this internal process. First of all, of course, to consider the usefulness of the process, and then to consider how to impact the project design to make it more relevant for our research or knowledge production needs. Because as was mentioned, often it happens that we are contacted at a very late stage, and that makes it seem like we are more of an administrative check in the box than actually making something beneficial or establishing a long-term working relationship. And of course, as I mentioned already, finding the right people for this, because even if we in the Sami Council, we do work a lot with indigenous knowledge, and we don't have a specific structure or a team of knowledge holders who could just jump into project. So it's case by case when we have to look who's the best person for this. Yeah, so allow time for actually learning with each other to come to be a team, and not to be someone who contributes a little bit here and there, but actually being able to impact the research design, and then allow time for the project or for the process for making it happen.
Thank you. For example, being a co-principal investigator in a funded project. Monica, did you want to share anything in relation to the question of genuine co-production and knowledge?
Yeah, so what we're doing here now, you know, the situation, the political situation in Indonesia is not in favor of, you know, indigenous rights. So it's very difficult to us to do the political lobbying and to assist the indigenous bill that we have in the Parliament House. We will still doing that in the future. You know, it's important to assist those that bill, and then to keep doing the political lobbying in order to get the recognition from the government in the legal process. But what we're doing now is really to strengthen the indigenous communities facing this crisis and facing this political situations that will give, you know, many more conflicts in indigenous territories, and that will give, you know, many chance for another big numbers of criminalization. We are strengthening the indigenous communities now, and we're doing food sovereignty program in indigenous communities. So we encourage them to do the farming and help each other. So indigenous communities helping each other, and also together with the local farmers and local communities. I think it's very important to strengthen the movement of indigenous peoples in the middle of this situation. And now we're still facing this pandemic, and it's restricted us to do, traveling, but we will maximize the online platform to write those stories, those resilient stories from indigenous communities. And, this kind of documents can also help the government to see, we have this traditional knowledge, we have this traditional practice that you can use, and that the government can adopt in the national regulations or policies. So yeah, that's what we do. We're doing here now in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Monica. Especially your comments in relation to the challenges, the very fundamental challenges that you face. Building upon that, a question came in via chat indicating that Monica gave the example of including Indigenous peoples on national delegations to UN entities as a way to engage Indigenous peoples. Could the panelists speak on other opportunities or good practices for ethical engagement of Indigenous knowledge in addressing climate change and biodiversity decline? Are there other examples? The reference to Indigenous Knowledge Forum. Are there other ways that we could cultivate the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge to produce the co-developed, co-created knowledge concerning climate change specifically? Are there other innovative and creative ways in which we might be able to do so in the future? I also want to point out that one of our colleagues in the facilitative working group has indicated in chat that it would be good to have other sessions to involve other actors to share their experiences. I am not a French-speaking individual, and they've gone on to say something further in French, but I believe that the sentiment is captured in the English language. But any thoughts or ideas about innovative and creative ways to really engender ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge to create opportunities for the co-production of knowledge? Any of our presenters?
Well, I can say a few words reflecting from the Biodiversity Convention, where I have been involved now for 8 years. It was mentioned that including Indigenous peoples into country delegations to these meetings can be one way of getting the views of Indigenous knowledge holders to the processes. For the Biodiversity Convention, often the Sami, we have also members who are parts of the country delegations, but like the Sami Council, we are not a member of the country delegation. So we are working through the Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and in the CBD, I would say that the Indigenous Forum on International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, it has quite a strong standing institutionally there. Like, as you may be aware of, there is a special working group on Article 8J, which is the Traditional Knowledge Working Group, and in these meetings, the Indigenous peoples and local communities representation there are certain procedures for enhanced participation. So, for example, we get to nominate a co-chair for this ad hoc meetings, and we have meetings with the bureau of the meeting, so we can discuss any issues that raise regarding the procedures that take place in the meetings. So just I wanted to bring this as an example how you could enhance Indigenous participation in the process. So I'm not so well aware of the Climate Change Convention, but I'm sure some issues are of more relevance for Indigenous peoples and local communities than others. And it is possible to have some kind of enhanced participation mechanisms in place for those issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aslak. Any other presenters want to comment? Valerie?
Thank you very much. I cannot answer on some aspects of what you have stressed, but I can share what we have tried to implement, not with Indigenous knowledge holders with respect to IPCC, but with early career scientists. And so we have made the timeline for our reports available. We have invited them at international meetings to be reviewers of our reports, and some of them have self-organized. I have in mind the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists in an impressive collaborative way. So building from that, I was thinking that there might be opportunities to further engage Indigenous knowledge holders through your networks to join the review of our reports on the science side at the various steps, and maybe it could be prepared now how to do it for the 7th IPCC assessment cycle after 2023. That is when the next assessment cycle will start. And I was also thinking that maybe initiatives with international climate science networks could favor learning on the side of early career scientists, but also on the side of Indigenous knowledge holders, how to start working together at an early stage of careers, because then it could have long-lasting effects. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that commentary. I think it's an important dimension to the work forward. Monica, Maria Eugenia, do you want to respond to this question about innovative and Monica? Yes.
Yeah, Delia, I'm trying to think about something applicable for this process, and I think it's important to look at the document of NDC from each countries and look at the commitment that being made by the governments or the states, so it doesn't remain as documents. It should be implemented at the national level. Yeah, for example, what I mentioned about the commitment of government of Indonesia in the NDC, and protecting indigenous peoples as part of mitigate and tackling the climate change. So it shouldn't remain as only documents. It should be implemented at the national level. So it's important to take a look back at those commitments and documents, existing documents that we have now, and push the government to really implement that. I think it's all.
Yeah. Thank you. And that I suppose to a large extent, if we think about it within the human rights framework, your point is highly relevant, because we have international norms and standards that affirm the right of Indigenous peoples to the ownership and control of their knowledge and intellectual property. And if we had even a small percentage of states around the globe recognizing and respecting those particular norms, that we would be further along in terms of the role and the place of and the treatment of Indigenous knowledge in every context, and not solely within the context of climate change. Maria Eugenia, do you have a brief response to the question of innovative and creative ways to achieve co-production of knowledge? Please.
Sí, muchas gracias. Pienso que es importante el involucramiento de pueblos indígenas, de mujeres indígenas, jóvenes indígenas, en lo que es una participación plena y efectiva. El trabajo en relación a lo que viene a ser buenas prácticas a nivel local, tanto a nivel nacional como a nivel internacional. A nivel internacional, la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad, la REMIP, que agrupa a instancias de América Latina y el Caribe, en coordinación con el Convenio de Biodiversidad, con la Secretaría del Convenio de Biodiversidad, y también dando seguimiento al grupo de trabajo del 8J, en el que existe una herramienta para que podamos trabajar de manera coordinada entre lo que es esta instancia internacional con la instancia nacional y local. Los talleres, por ejemplo, de formación para el refortalecimiento de los conocimientos tradicionales. Esta experiencia nos ha permitido, en cierta forma, llegar a instancias locales, y desde la instancia local también involucrarse en el contexto internacional, como es en el marco del CBD. Pienso que hay que abrir otros espacios en los que el involucramiento de los poseedores de los conocimientos y también quienes, pues de manera muy valiosa nos van apoyando, es importante considerar este involucramiento. A nivel local, que es el trabajo más difícil porque eso pasa también por recursos económicos, es importante cómo vamos a hacer la recuperación del conocimiento tradicional, porque sabemos que el conocimiento tradicional, conforme van muriendo nuestros ancianos y ancianas, va perdiendo nuestros conocimientos. El pueblo Uru era como 25 mujeres que hablaban y son las más mayores. Entonces, es un pueblo antiquísimo. Después son los aymaras y después son los otros pueblos, pero es un pueblo antiquísimo. Entonces, ¿cómo recuperar? Porque, o sea, en el idioma está también la técnica de producción, la técnica de reproducción de los animales, el cuidado, el mirar la naturaleza, el leer la naturaleza. Entonces, obviamente que tiene que ir estos proyectos para instancias locales de trabajo, de investigación, de reflexión, de incentivar el conocimiento tradicional. De trabajo, yo diría, pues tenemos, este espacio de lo que estamos viviendo, la crisis climática, el cambio climático, nos lleva a mirar las arrugas de nuestras abuelas y abuelos. Gracias.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, this is a very, very serious issue that has been raised by past presenters as well, in terms of the interrelated nature of language, of knowledge, of the practices for example, Aslak had made reference to, potentially this might be an important thread in the ongoing discussion of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and that Indigenous knowledge and language should be a focus, an element of the dialogue there. And I'm certain that Indigenous peoples working within that realm at UNESCO in the context of the International Decade are looking at this particular issue. I just also wanted to give further amplification to the idea that Valerie has made mention of in terms of early career scientists as a potential model for encouraging increased co-production of knowledge, or genuine co-production of knowledge. And this is something that Anna Kurtula spoke about in the last webinar, but not specifically as an example. And it was interesting that we had Alicia Mousseau, a Lakota woman who's a trained scientist, but presented in her PowerPoint images generated on the basis of Indigenous knowledge, and then side by side with an organizational structure created by Western scientists and held side by side. And you could see some threads and similarities, but what was most compelling about her remarks was that as a trained clinical psychologist, she was able to more easily weave the two approaches together to gain more meaningful context for the people in her community, especially in relation to substance abuse, for example. I want to now turn to the item that everyone spoke to either directly or indirectly in terms of the substantive nature of Indigenous knowledge and its source in the context of self-determination of Indigenous peoples and their political institutions and the issues of governance. My question is, does the right to free, prior, and informed consent have a place within this dialogue about co-production of knowledge? Are there certain elements in relation to the political institutions? I know that Aslak, you commented to some extent on the identification of the right persons and who are the people that you go to, as well as how many Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities are overwhelmed by the request for the request for collaborating on research projects. But if we can take a moment and think about that collective dimension of consenting, if in fact there are protocols and guidelines that have been put in place, what is it that substantively helps to operationalize or implement those protocols and guidelines, and where are they sourced, and does free, prior, and informed consent have relevance in this particular context? Aslak?
Well, yeah, I can comment on the FPIC side, not so much on the protocol side, because yeah, we don't have so many protocols in place. But what comes to the question regarding if free, prior, and informed consent has a place in this, then I think the answer is that definitely it does, or it should have. As I briefly touched upon in my presentation, was that there are many types of Indigenous knowledge, and some of it is better to be kept out of the public. So some information can have monetary value, like as I mentioned, some let's say the best hunting spots or the berry picking sites or so on. Same comes to sacred sites. I don't think we want to make all our sacred sites a tourist attraction, even though be that the national center that I'm not sure what's the English word, but who measure land and they release the public maps, then they have actually put on and that here is the sacred Sami stone on the map, and that's on their view that's public information, or they made it public. So I think definitely there is a need for a process where at least even if this kind of bodies with a full mandate are not in place, then at least a group of experts, knowledge holders, as well as people who are aware of intellectual property rights and protection of cultural heritage. There should be some kind of reference group to discuss case by case, is there something here that we don't want to release for the public, and what do we want to release? Because I know there are cases where indigenous peoples have opened up their knowledge systems more in the face of climate crisis, that we really have this urge that we need to share whatever we can, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something that we want to keep for ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very, very briefly, do any other panel members want to address that specific question? And I now note that there's a specific question for Valerie. So, and we also have, we're beginning to wind down in terms of time and interpretation, but very quickly, if there's a response from Maria Eugenia or Monica on the issue of the intersection of free, prior, and informed consent. And then I would really like to allow Valerie to respond to the question that has come into chat. So.
Sí, a mí me gustaría también compartir respecto al derecho al consentimiento previo, libre e informado. Es un derecho, es un principio de mucho respeto por el que aquí va también qué se comparte y qué no se comparte. Por la experiencia de trabajo también en el tema de gobernanza, de autoridades tradicionales y en el tema de salud, por ejemplo, salud indígena. Salud indígena tiene mucho que ver con la parte espiritual y difícilmente, seamos concretos, que esta experiencia de espiritualidad va a ser compartida de manera pública porque nos decían, son conocimientos y saberes que pasa por una cuestión sobrenatural. Entonces, eso lo llevan muy, muy dentro. La cuestión sobre todo de espiritualidad, en el que sí diremos, respecto, tomando en cuenta también la titularidad, los poseedores del conocimiento respecto a la espiritualidad andina, toda la implicancia, la complejidad que implica esto. Y también quiero hacer referencia al tema de la libre determinación. Si bien es un concepto muy reciente, el concepto de libre determinación, pero el espíritu de lucha de los pueblos indígenas es ancestral, es pues desde la llegada de la invasión. Entonces no se conoce con ese nombre de libre determinación, sino, sin embargo, ha sido una lucha incesante, diremos, de que los pueblos puedan vivir con sus conocimientos tradicionales en todo su sistema económico, político, social, cultural. Gracias.
Thank you, Maria. Quickly, Monica, do you have a response to this question about the role of free, prior, and informed consent? And then we'll turn to Valerie. I think, Valerie, you've been able to read the question in the chat. Okay, so Monica?
Yeah, so just short one. I think FPIC can be done internally and externally. So for Indigenous peoples dealing with the outsiders, right? And the outsiders means it could be investors or the governments. They have to respect the rights of the FPIC of Indigenous peoples, even before like the project started. And then internally, like we have here in many Indigenous communities, they also have their own protocols that practicing their collective rights. So the Indigenous institutions plays big roles in here. They even with us in Oman, we always leave the decision to the Indigenous community. We only let them know that you have these rights and everything. There is this opportunities and everything, but it's their decision, and in the decision-making process in their community, they have to involve the youth, the women, the elders, everyone should be involved in the decision-making process, and that is collective rights. And it's part of the community protocol, which is part of also part of the FPIC, like internally in that community. Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. And sorry to rush everyone, but I'll turn to Valerie and then hand it right to Tom in order to begin our wrap up. But Valerie, on the question shown in chat.
Yes, so the question is related to the emphasis on the framework of adaptation rather than mitigation related to indigenous knowledge. So I think that one part is related to the indigenous knowledge itself and the multi-generation knowledge on managing risks, on managing sustainably ecosystems. That is closely related to a number of adaptation dimensions. It is also related to the vulnerability of indigenous communities, I think. However, I think that there might be a potential to develop, possibly, new indigenous knowledge related to the mitigation part, especially on aspects related to the implementation of just transitions, with the intent that what matters is that these transitions, so how to transform what you do so that you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, leaving no one behind. And there might be aspects related to indigenous knowledge that could help for how to implement these transitions to be fair and perceived to be fair. And I would like to add one aspect. If I look at the peer-reviewed literature, the scientific literature related to indigenous knowledge, I also find this very heavy imbalance. There might be exceptions, and I think exceptions could be related to aspects related to land management. So there might already be more available indigenous knowledge on land management that can help reduce emissions. There was a remark on the chat from somebody from Benin in Africa that goes, I think, in that direction. And a last remark is that what has been stressed related to indigenous knowledge, I also find it quite striking related to the role of women and the gender dimension as well. And I think there might be opportunities to also consider the gender dimensions related to mitigation with a stronger emphasis.
Okay. Thank you very much. A huge thank you to each of the presenters. Kuyanakbak for your contributions. Let me hand it off to Tom. And again, we'll be in touch via email. Tom?
Great, thanks very much, Daly. Before we conclude, I just have a few remarks. I'm very cognizant that the interpretation has a hard stop in about 1 minute, so I just want to start off by thanking our interpreters for all their hard work and providing us their interpretation throughout the presentations. So part of my intervention might be a bit in English only, but hopefully I can get through it relatively quickly. So I think there's just 4 closing points that I'd like to make. First is that if you missed any of our previous webinars, again, they're on YouTube. As you can see from this PowerPoint slide, we had a diverse range of speakers from all over the world. So we'd be looking forward to your participation, or to you sharing these YouTube videos and these webinars across your networks. Share it with parties, with other Indigenous peoples, anyone who might be interested, and we'd encourage you to take advantage of this web series. Secondly, I want to just speak briefly to next steps. So this is our final webinar in terms of our series of webinars, but we will be producing a report based on the key findings and recommendations that have kind of come out from each speaker from each webinar. Once we have a draft report, we intend to have one final kind of discussion where previous speakers are invited to come back, comment on the report, what might have we missed, what needed more attention, those kinds of considerations. So we're hoping to organize this for May, but we don't have a firm date yet. So I encourage you to continue to check the UNFCCC website for updates and your mail list if you're on the Friends of the LCIPP distribution list. Also, in terms of informing the report, and I'd like to invite any of our speakers today and any of those in the chat. For example, Coleman, I know you spoke to some other participants who would have some good resources. If there are any protocols, recommendations, or findings or resources that you would like to see reflected in that report, or you think that should be shared or posted on the website, we are more than happy to receive that content. So please do send it in, either through the LCIPP address or through Daly or myself. Third, I just wanted to speak a bit about some linked opportunities that are going on under other activities of the platform. So while we talked about a few entry points and our speakers made some very good recommendations on entry points in engaging Indigenous knowledge holders in the UNFCCC process, I did want to flag that as part of activity 7 of the platform, there is a comprehensive mapping exercise being done to kind of identify some of the intersection points with Indigenous knowledge and climate change related bodies, both in the UNFCCC but also more broadly. So I won't speak to that slide in any depth, but I think it's a useful example of some of the opportunities that we're identifying. And also I wanted to mention activity 9, just based on Monica's comment, which is mapping NDCs, national adaptation plans, and other policies and communications under the convention for how Indigenous peoples and local communities have been engaged in those communications. So I think there's some strong linkages and some ways to build off that activity and its findings with what we heard today, especially around Monica's comments. So I would encourage others to look forward to that. And then finally, I would just very sincerely like to thank all of our speakers for your time, for your thoughtful perspectives and the recommendations that you've made on some tangible way forward. Again, I'd like to thank the interpreters, all the participants who asked questions and commented and joined us today, and the Secretariat for all their support in helping pull this off and throughout the process. And finally, my colleague Daly, I'd like to thank you for all your support and your leadership in driving this webinar series forward. And with that, Daly, I'll just turn it briefly to you if you have any closing words.
My only closing comment is, again, a big thank you to all of the presenters, and I look forward to our outreach, especially in relation to finalizing our report for this activity, and as a key element of your contributions, and similar to an important guideline in the context of Indigenous knowledge, your validation of the final report, your review to ensure that it is accurate and a good reflection of the contributions that you've made. And I look forward to that opportunity. Once again, thank you for your time, your energy, and please take care and remain healthy and strong on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Qiyanak, thank you.
Thank you, Daly. Thank you, Thomas.
Welcome. All right. Bye.